we have a dominant cultural logic or kind of common sense around poverty where we think it's a matter of, that there is a fair marketplace, right? And that those that are deserving and skilled are rewarded by that fair marketplace. And if they're not, then it's because of some pathology or, a personal failure. That wasn't the common sense about poverty in American history. And there was a turn towards it that I don't think people are fully aware of. So, and it's particularly impactful, obviously, for the racial justice movement. And I think, famously through the Moynihan report, culture of poverty kind of line, even though I think that was maybe slightly misunderstood in what he was trying to say, but there was a liberal turn in kind of treating poverty like it was a set of behaviors, attitudes, affects, and pathologies, and that it should be targeted that way. And so you get the famous, like, a mind is a terrible thing to waste, right? Or you get a respectability politics that's telling Black people that in order to combat issues of racism or disenfranchisement, the goal for them should be to better function for the standards of the market and to eliminate those pathologies. And despite our progress, I think it's gotten worse in a way. Now mindfulness is part of every corporate boardroom, no matter what race you are. I think there are ways in which that tendency has gotten more extreme. So I would love for you to unpack the history of that.
Well, I'll get the ball rolling and I'll turn the virtual mic over to my pop after this. I know that Michael Katz who was a scholar I'd very much admired, and so that means that I really liked his work. But I was surprised to learn that in the early 2000s that he insisted that underclass ideology had run its course, that the appeal of underclass ideology had faded, when, if anything, it struck me that it was hegemonic, even more hegemonic, right? People maybe didn't use the term underclass by the early 2000s, but you didn't need the term anymore because it was just part of the common sense of what poor people were, across racial lines, I might add. So I had, for a number of years, beginning about 10 or 15 years ago, I frequently asked my students what the defining characteristics of poor people were. And there was really one answer I was looking for. An interesting thing is, I rarely got the answer that I was looking for. What I got from them was that poor people were they didn't work hard. So they were, lazy, basically. They didn't value education. They were irresponsible. So they used drugs and, made a lot of babies. And the last thing that students were disposed to say is that they were unemployed, underemployed, or just fundamentally for some other reason, didn't have enough money. And so that was, along with the response to Hurricane Katrina, I would say too, that was a clear expression of the hegemony of this stuff. And what we get, as you said, Ariella, and my father had alluded to earlier, is an insistence that poverty is fundamentally a character flaw. And you see this all over the place, right? I mean, you see this in the stand-up work of comedians, ranging from, it's not a big range that I'm going to point to, I'll just point to two that I like, Chris Rock and Dave Chappelle. You see versions of that running through their stuff to varying degrees. And you could certainly make the case that prior to the New Deal, people understood poverty, viewed poverty through the lens of defectiveness too. I mean, W.B. Du Bois, it's funny that people often enough attach themselves to Du Bois at the stretch of his life where it might make sense to call him a radical Democrat, but overlooking how long he lived and what kind of politics he had, let's say, in the 1890s, that informed his take on the take on poverty and Black Philadelphia that one finds in the Philadelphia Negro.
Also, sorry, just to briefly interject, I think a lot of these things also were part and parcel of a eugenicist notion of the way that intelligence is spread across race, or gendered notions of intelligence, things that presumed like a biological primacy to what would make one successful. And I think Du Bois more than nodded at that.
Definitely more
than notions.
Definitely more than nodded. But even in his and others more enlightened moments, there's a culturalist dimension to this. I mean, I don't know that you can always clearly distill from the culture of poverty and the biology of poverty for those who embrace those kinds of frameworks. But the subjects of my first book, the National Urban League, certainly on the one hand pushed back against eugenics, or at least the scientific racism understanding of eugenics in the years before the New Deal. But on the other hand, the way that they pushed back against eugenics came down to kind of culturalist understandings of poverty, at least in part, right? That centered on cultural tutelage for, the benighted Black migrant masses, let's say. And interesting enough, I mean, something on the spectrum of Robin DiAngelo, in a sense, but that's not fair to the Urban League. It was much better than Robin DiAngelo, for what it's worth. I've thus set the bar pretty low, though, so that's a problem. But anyway, insofar as they presumed that if Blacks demonstrated their assimilability, that those demonstrations of acculturation would basically push back effectively against racism. Obviously, when you get to the New Deal and the Popular Front, though, the sensibilities of even fairly conservative Black Americans change quite a bit, and you get an understanding of poverty that's much more rooted in political economy. You have Black activists who insist, among other things, that finally, at this point, that the Booker T. Washington framework that should actually sound kind of familiar to us now, kind of individualist, almost bootstraps, but certainly entrepreneurial-oriented strategy for group uplift, in which entrepreneurs would pull up the masses of Blacks.
It's like the first hustle culture with influencer was Booker T. Washington.
Yeah. I mean, minus the pernicious influence of Russell Simmons and the downstream pernicious influence of Yo MTV Raps many, many decades down the line, but very much so. But again, by the Great Depression, certainly by the New Deal, Black activists and political organizers understood that to be backward, because they appreciated the fact that in capitalism, most people couldn't be entrepreneurs, right? So, I mean, most of us had to be workers, and that was the case certainly for Black Americans. So you have that piece that informs the pushback against that stuff. And the path forward, as they understood it, since there was a kind of randomness, I mean, there were forces beyond the control of any individual Black person or white person, the path forward to racial group progress wasn't entrepreneurialism as they saw it, but something more on the spectrum of social democracy for many. I mean, you can look at, let's say, the NAACP annual conference from 1933, and literally have people who are participants, right? So not random Joe Schmoes, but participants literally pushing back against the Washingtonian understanding of group progress that I alluded to explicitly and unambiguously, right? And in that moment, where millions of whites have been impacted negatively, some devastated, and an even greater percentage of Blacks have been devastated by the Great Depression, then you get an unambiguous appreciation for the problem with culturalist interpretations of inequality, right? And those come back, obviously, to jump ahead in Cold War, and they come back with abandon. Now, one thing that's distinct, I suppose, from the Cold War era with the invention of poverty as something, as a condition that exists apart from political economy, is that really was a pushback, right? I mean, that was on the heels of a broad collective understanding that poverty wasn't poverty, but instead it was joblessness and low wages. And it's not a done deal in the 50s. It takes a while for that side to win. And my father alluded to a number of the political forces that had to come in line to get us to where we were by Moynihan. But when you get to the Kennedy-Johnson administration, it's certainly not accurate to say that the jig is up, because there's still some more fighting to be done on this matter. But it's pretty clear at that point, in retrospect anyway, that this was the beginning of the end, right? Or maybe it was the end of the end by Nixon, I suppose, because the beginning of the end was a little earlier. I imagine my dad wants to elaborate on this, so I'll shut up and turn the virtual mic over to him.
Yeah, I could just say a little bit more about this, but yeah, I think that's right. I mean, but yeah, I think it is useful to say something about how that struggle in the 50s went, right? And played out. And I know this isn't what we had anticipated talking about, probably not what you guys anticipated for us to talk about either. But so for this other book that I've been working on for a long time, I've known this because I was an undergraduate in the 1960s and I read this stuff then as text, but I've become much more impressed at how central the role of all the American social sciences were in the decade and a half after World War II for making class and political economy absolutely invisible in discussion of American life, right? It's kind of shocking the way they did it, right? Well, but sociologists were the worst. Now, I'm not talking about economists because they worship in a different church than the rest of us do. And it's a church where the cross hangs upside down, as far as I've noticed. But the psychologists aren't that much better. But anyway, the psychologists, the sociologists, the political scientists, and even the anthropologists, for whom I tend to have a softer spot. Well, it's extraordinary how they went on a full bore campaign to turn class into culture and to make political economy invisible. The sociologists did it most flamboyantly, right? Because they literally redefined class as a category of culture and did stuff like define classes by the kind of stuff you had in your living room, shit like that, right? But the working class in particular increasingly becomes like a category that's in effect of ethnicity. So it's like gendered, right? So it's male and it's white and it typically wears a hard hat and a plaid shirt and is by definition conservative. So you can't be working class without being Archie Bunker, basically. And I mean, political scientists did the same thing the others did, the same, same kind of stuff. So by the time you get around to Moynihan, I think the most, the most insidious thing that Moynihan does in that report on the Negro family comes before he gets into it even, right? So in the preface, he just asserts that in America, the way that we think about equality now is between groups. So it doesn't have anything to do with like rich versus poor. It's like how my group is stacking up against your group. And that's what opens the door for him to discuss Negro poverty in the way that he discussed it. And then that gets, and that reinforces like this conflation and confusion that we've had ever since. And it works particularly nicely for the PO or for the professional and managerial strata of the people of color populations, right? POC, PMC just has a nice ring, right? Because of the slippage, right, between first person singular and first person plural that this discourse depends on and enables. And it's like, who could ask for a better hustle, basically, right? But what that means is that class skewed benefits, right, that are distributed in a class skewed way count for everybody, right, who identifies with that group. And now this is jumping probably farther ahead than we want to at this point, I don't know, but you fast forward to 2015 and 2016, right, when working class is like no longer just this beefy guy, but working class, it itself becomes a literal racial category in the minds of the woke left. Although Walter Ben Michael says properly we shouldn't be using woke anymore because it belongs to the right at this point. But so I'll call it the MSNBC left, right? Since there's a picture that comes into my mind when I say it and hear it. That by the time 2016 comes, if you make a reference to a working class political program, then the immediate response from anti-racist activists is the accusation that invoking the working class is just a backhanded way to curry favor with white racists. So then all of a sudden, blacks and Hispanics and other non-whites, all of whom are disproportionately part of the working class, no longer get to be part of it. And then therefore, what they're really concerned about is your police killing. And yeah, everybody's concerned about police killing, except the police who kill. And closing the wealth gap.
Well, and moralism is a big part of the story too, right? I mean, moralism,
right, absolutely.
How we talk about poverty, and contemporaneously with the sort of culturalist turn toward inequality as it pertains to poverty, we have a version of the same thing happening at, again, roughly the same time or at the same time about race too, right? So the fact that the caste framework, let's say, has come back now is an interesting commentary on this moment, because if you take this back to the Oliver Cox era, and explore Cox's work in relation to, let's say, his critiques of Gunnar Myrdal. And so Myrdal was one of the champions of kind of moralistic case against racism, right? And Oliver Cox, the black social scientist, pushed back against that. And what Cox was dismayed by is a tendency of Myrdal and a growing number of liberals to talk about racial inequality, again, it's kind of moralistic terms that were free of political economy. And Cox was very clear in context. And it's interesting how not only has he been not received the attention that he deserves, it's worse than that. There are people who essentially misrepresent the case that he made, because he certainly was alive to the realness of racism. But for him, much like the Field sisters and us, racism was an expression of class exploitation. He read Jim Crow through the lens of the exploitation of blacks at the hands of Southern oligarchs. And that was a framework so racism, though, was bound up, it was inextricably linked to class, right? Class exploitation for Cox. And that was an expression of a sentiment that was quite, dominant in the 30s and 40s, right? Through World War II, anyway. You find many blacks who made some version of that same case, that, again, racism and racial inequality were expressions of class exploitation. And, obviously by the end of the 40s, that would change, right? And along with contemporaneously with the turn toward the culturalist understanding of poverty, two versions of the same thing.
If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.